Velkommen, welcome. Today's talk will be held in English, but first some information for our Norwegian viewers. Velkommen til denne strømmingen fra Nasjonalmuseet for kunst, arkitektur og design. I dag er vi tilbake i konserveringsatelieret på Nasjonalgalleriet i Oslo, hvor vi skal bli bedre kjent med et av de mest populære maleriene som hang her, nemlig Vinternatt i Rondane av Harald Sohlberg. Sendingen vil senere bli publisert med norsk tekst på YouTube og kanskje også på Facebook, siden sendingen vil foregå på engelsk. Det er mulig å stille spørsmål underveis i kommentarfeltet på både Facebook og YouTube. Disse vil bli besvart etter foredraget er ferdig. Welcome to this live stream from Nasjonalmuseet in Oslo. Today we are back at the National Gallery and we are going to learn more about one of our most popular paintings, Winternight in the Mountains by Harald Sohlberg. Painting conservator Thierry Ford and curator Mai Britt Guleng will return to talk more about this painting and teach us about the stunning view and its story and state. It's possible to ask questions during the talk, and they will be answered after the talk. Over to you, Thierry and Mai Britt.
Thank you and welcome. And here we are again, Mai Britt.
Yes.
So this time we're looking at a very different painting from last time, also by a famous Norwegian artist, and of a very sort of, well, we'll see, very sort of typical, perhaps Norwegian scene, and also an artist working at the same time as Munch, which we looked at in the previous presentation. But as you'll see throughout the course of this presentation, we hope that we'll be able to share with you that the painting is very different in terms of technique and style from last time. I mean, firstly, just the sheer size of the canvas. It's quite a huge painting, 160 by 180 centimeters. And what we're seeing here is a depiction of snow-covered mountains in the winter in the Rondane region, which is a region of mountains about 3 kilometers north of Oslo, on a cold, clear night with some stars. And maybe you want to say something about...
Maybe I can just say
take
that
over.
it's not 3 kilometers. If that was,
sorry, 3 hours. 3 hours. Sorry.
3 hours drive, yes, with a car.
Yeah.
So it's quite distant from Oslo, actually. And it's an amazing painting. I think it's amazing. It has this evocative, emotional effect, and it has very much to do with the technique. And we will be talking a little bit more about that, but also to do with the motif in itself and the way he has composed the composition as a whole. And the director of the National Gallery, when it was acquired in 1918, he called it a shining architecture, a frozen poem. That was Jens Thies, the director. So shining architecture, frozen poem. I think it's beautifully phrased. And the painting is very popular in Norway. It was actually in an informal viewer election. It was voted for as Norway's national painting in 1995. But I think that a lot of people in Norway will know the painting, but they don't know the painter.
Yes, and the paintings from, because you mentioned we acquired it in 1918, but it's dated 1914.
Yes, it is.
So there's something also we'll look at is this sort of, it took the artist quite many years to finish and to complete. But maybe we can say something a bit about the artist Harald Sohlberg and the actual motif. Maybe you could.
So Harald Sohlberg, as we say in Norwegian, he was born in 1869 here in Kristiania, which is Oslo today. He was Munch's junior by 6 years, and they knew each other. And he was quite an established painter, actually, when he made this in 1914. He had been studying in Oslo, in Copenhagen, in Paris, in Weimar, and he was even acquired by the National Gallery. So he often traveled around when he wanted to find new motifs. So he was traveling to different places in Norway.
So how did this, what gave him, how did this start, the idea to paint these mountains in Rondane? What is...
Actually, it was a coincidence because one day he met a friend on the street and he was invited to join for a trip to the Rondane mountain region for an Easter ski trip. And that was in 1899. So a group of young men, they traveled with skis and dogs and tents. They were inspired by the North Pole expedition by Fridtjof Nansen and Eivind Astrup 3 years earlier. And they wanted to be just as tough as those boys. So they tried to spend the first night out of doors. But only Sohlberg managed because it was really cold. And Sohlberg was a very sporty man. He had been doing sports all his life. And then he was amazed by what he saw. And on the trip back home, he made this draft, so that you see on the screen now. It's it's drawn on the backside of an envelope, on the train, actually. But he had made up his mind, I have to paint this. I have to make a big painting. So, and then he went back the year after, and he settled down in mountain cabins and moved around. And he also spent a lot of time out the door. He was walking and walking up to the peaks, down in the valleys, and seeing the mountains from different angles, because he didn't place himself in front of the mountains. He was walking around and he was analyzing the mountains. So he was making lots of drafts, and we can see another one here. It's a newly acquired watercolor for our collection. So he made lots of drafts, and he not only needed to see the landscape, he also needed to have the feeling of its power. So he was swimming in icy water because he needed to feel what nature really was. It had strong impact. And he, on New Year's Eve, 1900, he spent the last hours of the century out of doors on one of those peaks, alone, under the stars. So it was, I guess it was really cold, but amazing. So, but this place, Rondane, I've been there. Have you?
I have, yes. Actually, it was, for me, it was quite an experience, because in 2014-15, I actually restored this painting, and so I really felt that I had to sort of go and visit the mountain region to sort of get a feel to kind of understand what I was looking at and restoring. And it's a very sort of desolate place. It's and it can be quite harsh in the winter. You meant, very cold as well. So
yes,
quite impressive that he stayed out. Because I think even the weather forecast is now announcing like -17 in the Rondane region for this weekend. So for those going up there, but like you said, it wasn't. It's not like it's not just from one vantage point. It seems to be a combination of different vantage points. And but although if you go there today, there is this Sohlberg place where you do get the feel of what we're seeing today. You should be able to see that on the screen. There's a photograph there, so it's possible to get that feel, but it obviously very different. But maybe What is interesting here is so you think he moved there in 1900, so we think that that's when he started perhaps to paint.
Yeah. He started to analyze the landscape, but he also started to make drafts and to plan the composition, and he made some small oil paintings. But do we know when he started on this large canvas?
Yeah, we're not sure. I mean, there's the expert, Professor Øyvind Stormberger, mentions that he thinks that from sort of 1900, 1901, there are sort of indications that he is working on this large canvas. And then also later in May, I think he moves a little bit, he moves his lodgings a little further up the river south. And there, I think there's some mention of there could have been an accident with the painting and he had to repaint certain areas. But then in 1902 and 1903, he actually seems to abandon the painting altogether and moves to the mining town of Røros, further north. And if I'm right in saying, it's not really until 1911, 1913, so a long time afterwards, that he actually comes back and sort of revisits the canvas with his family.
Because then in spring 1911 he goes back, and because he needs to finish this painting, and he brings his family because now he's married to his lovely wife Lily. And here we can see a photograph of him, of Harald Sohlberg on ski in Rondane. And on the other photograph you see his three boys, Harald, Einar and Dag. And the wife is hiding behind the three kids. And they are there to support the father and husband in his struggle to finish the work, because this is really important to him in his career. And he also goes briefly back in 1913, because he needs to have this contact with the motif, to be there on the spot. But at the same time, it's not really a portrait. It's not the true view of the place. But anyway, he needed to be there. And but why do you think? Did he paint it outdoors?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, there are indications, and we'll see later with when we look at the condition of the canvas. There are indications that he did have, and also from some letters, that he seems to have been working on the canvas early on. And there's actually quite a nice. Already in 1900, there's a letter to his mother, I believe, where there's a little sort of sketch of people skiing, of himself skiing, perhaps, and also of the large canvas outside, probably his lodgings, and showing how difficult it was to paint outside. Although I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's possible that he had the painting just outside his lodgings and outside that I'm sure. But I think, like you said, he was using all these other aides memoirs, the sketches and some photography to help him put it all together. And so I very much doubt that he took the huge canvas out into the actual sort of wild. I think it was more just outside his lodgings.
And actually he finished it in Oslo. So he brought it back to Oslo and finished it here in June or July 1914. But we mentioned it in the beginning that his method, his technique is very special. But could you say something more about it? Because what's so special about it?
Well, I mean, firstly, compared to the last presentation, it's really, it's completely different to Munch. It's the opposite in a way. It's, Sohlberg has a very, at this point in time, he has a very sort of precise and carefully planned sort of approach, and very much attention to detail. And this, what's quite interesting about his works is that if you use infrared reflectography, you can see often a lot of underdrawing. And like here we have, should be on your screen now, there's a nice little detail of the trees on the left-hand side, and you see very precise black underdrawing. Also, like I mentioned, this interest in detail, these mainly the whole sort of mountains areas that are painted with he uses very sort of thin brushstrokes, and there's also should be a detail to show you this, where he's painting with this very vibrant blue color over a light white ground. So you get it's a very precise technique. And maybe this had something to do with his sort of artistic training, his background. He was initially trained, unlike other artists at the time, he was trained with a decorative painter at the beginning, and this might have had some considerable influence on his sort of his technical approach. But by 1900, he had, in a way, found his sort of style and created his own style, which was interesting. And this had really all come about one painting, which is painted much before Vinternatt, which was painted in 1893, Evening Glow. And this had a great success. And the difference here is that Sohlberg had this kind of, like all artists at the time, had a little bit of a looser, freer style, but he went back to maybe a more sort of traditional style. And you can see here there's a nice cross-section from this painting that shows Sohlberg painting in very sort of thin layers and using this sort of glazing technique. And for those who don't know what a glaze is basically it's when you apply a thin, semi-transparent or transparent layer, maybe with a little bit of color in it, over an opaque layer, so you get a sort of different tonal effect. So instead of Munch, mixing his paints on the canvas, he's actually this glazing technique, which is nothing new. I mean, it's used. It's a historic sort of technique. Look at the Dutch painters, but he's sort of come back to that interestingly, and you're getting this optical mixing, and this is something that he really continues to use. And he's also quite interesting. He's also using this sort of intermediate varnishes in between the layers and playing a little bit with this partial varnishing. So he seems to be very much in touch and very concerned about the technical aspects of painting. So having these sort of very precise underdrawings and the quality and the durability of paints. He has very. We were lucky to have access to some of his diaries, which show that he describes in detail, and there's something quite specific about this painting, and that's the actual blue color.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but because there are several other colors as well, but it's intensely blue, and if you look closely, you will see that there is some purple, some green, some black, of course, and yellow, but it's intensely blue. And Sohlberg, even if he had compositions with several colors, he always insisted on that the painting should have one main color. So if he wanted to enhance the sky, the red sky or the blue, the yellow sky, he had to subdue the other colors and to subordinate them to the main color. So, but in this case, we have the fantastic blue color. And I'm curious, can you tell more about the blue color?
Yeah, so in when I was working on the painting in 2014-15, I did some portable XRF examinations to see if I could identify the main pigment here. And we have a lot of lead white, but what I did find is that we have predominantly the pigment cobalt blue. And so that was quite interesting, and also very interesting that also at that time we've been well, no, actually, recently we've been the museum has been generously given these paint boxes by Sohlberg, and also some paint tubes, and that was quite interesting because in the paint box, well, there is, you know, a very nice sort of tube of cobalt blue, and in a letter to his mother, I think in 1903. This is kind of interesting because it's the time he's in Røros when he's actually perhaps not working with his painting. He's actually asking for a specific type of cobalt blue, which was from Belgium. So he's very concerned about the quality. So maybe he was, you know, still experimenting, because the paintings from Røros period, they're not blue. So he's probably still working with that. But at the same time, I'll just look at these. These are quite interesting, seeing as we've been given these. So this was probably the sort of typical paint box, field paint box. I mean, these were common throughout the 19th century and early 20th century. And this he would have probably had. Whether it's the one, that I don't know, but this is what he would have had, you know, when he was painting outdoors for doing his little sketches. And we also have here, which is quite nice, we have a sort of quite a good collection of these very thin brushes, which again confirms his sort of paint technique. Another thing which is also very interesting is that Sohlberg was also, like I said, in touch with materials and aspects of durability. And he also writes that he was concerned about the yellowing effects of linseed oil, so linseed oil that's mixed with paints, and that he preferred later to go over to sort of more nut oils. And we have also a nice example of a bottle of nut oil from a Norwegian supplier here. And then I mentioned early on about the use of infrared to see beneath the surface, and not actually in this painting, because I think that there's several reasons why. But in another painting called Summer Night, we have a very, very nice example of his very precise pencil drawing, underdrawings, and also you can see this kind of grid effect that he's using. And that was to sort of, you know, get the proportions correct. But I'm sort of interested why he stuck to this style. Maybe you can.
Yes, it's very interesting, and it's really original. And I think being original was actually a point for Sohlberg. He didn't go the same path as his contemporary artists, because they tried to do something original by painting with thick layers and thick brush strokes. But he went this way. He chose to use the glazing technique, and what it gave him was the opportunity to present a glowing painting with this amazing color, because the glazing technique, it opens up the picture room, because it's as if there is a lot of room, space behind the picture surface. And as you see in this painting, he has also a lot of details. You can see from the trees over here. They are really thinly painted. So this gave him, the technique gave him the opportunity to be original, but also to represent greatness in the detail, through the detail actually, and to have this amazing color effect. And the composition here is in three parts. You see the foreground, and the mountains and the sky. And if you remember the first drafts, the sky was much lower, it was much smaller, but here he has opened up landscape. And you can also see some details here. It's in the foreground, we have some symbols, like the rotting trees in a cross. And in the mountain over here, it's a natural scar in the mountain. But here, Sohlberg has interpreted it and made it a Christian cross. And he has also worked on the composition, because if you remember the photograph that Thierry took on his holiday trip with his family, the mountains were more spread out. In this painting, he has pushed the mountains together, and he has, at the same time, he has opened up. It's like he's drawn the curtains aside and inviting us into this landscape. With the curtains, I mean the trees on both sides. It's like it's an entrance portal, and we can walk to the mountains, the icy mountains. And the mountains, they look really weird, because they are. Look at this profile. It's like the nose of a lying man. You can see the head, the nose, the mouth. And this is something that artists often did. They made nature anthropomorphic. It's like they have the shape of a human body. And he was not the only one. Other artists did that, like Nikolai Astrup and many others. And in total, all of these elements give the painting this strong emotive effect.
Yeah, and it attracts. It sort of does it attract? It seems to attract the public.
Yes,
yeah.
and it's like it's glowing in the dark, and you can see here an example from the exhibition in 2018 from the National Gallery. It's glowing in the dark, there's also one other trait, because you see in this painting there are no human beings. There are some cabins here, some mountain houses, what's in Norwegian called seter, and but there are no human beings. But in the first drafts, he made drawings of people, of skiers, actually, in the landscapes, as you can see in this drawing. There are two men walking in... no? Okay, sorry about that. But at least in the early drafts, he included the skiers. And what does it make of the painting when there are no human beings there? Well, the human beings are us. We are inside the painting, and we can imagine ourselves being there. So it opens up to imagination, and you can see in this in this other photograph from the exhibition, the children are sitting there with big eyes and looking at the painting, and they are amazed. It has a strong attraction. And yeah, I want to read to you what some of the thoughts Sohlberg had when he made this painting. It's quite a long quote, but it's very enlightening. And it tells a lot about all the different things he wanted to include in the work. So I will write now. It's a letter to Ludvig Ravensberg, another Norwegian artist from 1905, about this painting. One night I was skiing in a wild, depressing tract. The sky scintillated with thousands of twinkling, burning stars. I have rarely seen the heavens so brilliantly bejeweled, so vivid. I stood there captivated. All the questions poured into me about the planetary system, if there are worlds up there, if there actually could be a higher meaning in all this, and if death would yield an answer to that. I felt so small, so feeble, it seemed I was just a bug crawling about here in everyday squalor and trivialities and stupidities and nothingness. I grew anxious about what it might be and all I don't know. I have to paint this, I thought. This is true for me. This is death. A long journey through something ugly, something unattractive, something frightening, a terrible void. So what we see here is, to him, this was not a place in Rondane. This was about fundamental questions about being a human being just living for a certain amount of years. And then if there is eternity. So in a way, it's about fundamental anxiety. And when we think back at Munch's Scream, it's always also about fundamental anxiety, but in a very, very different way. This is much more calm. So it's in a way, it's comforting at the same time as it's a very unhospitable place. So it has cosmic dimensions, and I think that's what makes it so interesting and one of the main attractions with the work. But this is really serious stuff, and maybe there are other serious matters as well, because such a big painting, it's quite challenging. And so what is the condition of the work?
Yeah, no, the painting is stable now, but there's kind of quite an interesting sort of history of the condition, because if you can probably see, there's a lot of disturbing cracks going along over the whole surface, and these are what we call age cracks, or aging cracks, and these are predominantly due to various factors. It could be, it's most likely to, well, if he had the painting, in and out of different harsh climatic conditions, that wouldn't have helped. If the possibility of an accident where he might have washed over, and that probably wouldn't have helped. So there's a lot of issues going on, and also the questions of transportation. And here in particular, there's some very interesting, this is where it gets very nerdy when you go into conservation, but there's some interesting long cracks here that you can see, hopefully. And these, I think, are probably due to the painting having been rolled at certain points, so maybe when he took it back to Oslo on the train or up to Røros, I don't know. So this has been one of the main problems for the painting's condition. Also, not to forget, during the Second World War, all the paintings from the National Gallery were evacuated to the silver mines in Kongsberg. And what's quite interesting, a lot of the paintings, not just this painting, but a lot of the larger paintings had a lot of extensive conservation that had to be done afterwards. So, for obvious reasons, maybe the climate wasn't so good. But the conservation dossiers reveal, especially in the 1960s, there was a lot of problems with the paint starting to sort of flake. And so we were beginning to lose a lot of the composition. So the conservators at the time undertook what we call a wax lining. So they used a wax resin mixture to help adhere a sort of support canvas to the back, and at the same time it has a sort of a double function. We don't do this anymore, but it was very much in vogue at the time, and it worked. I mean, it worked that it consolidates. It allows to sort of to re-adhere the paint to the canvas. So today the painting is stable, although it's still, we still have to be careful, especially when it's out of its frame. But what's interesting about the conservation dossiers and this wax lining is that what I found in the files was actually a photograph from 1966, and fortunately the conservators at the time had documented some writing on the reverse of the canvas that you can't see now. and where it's got Harald Sohlberg's signature and the date, 1914, when he finally finished it. But also, quite interesting, it says Vinternatt i fjellene, so winter night in the mountains. So this is sort of interesting because I think there has been some little discussion, or at least he referred to it as like you mentioned now, as the mountains rather than the what we know as Rondane, those mountains in a sense. Yeah. So
the title has changed later.
So yeah, but I mean, what interests me is really how the painting was received when it came back to Oslo and was first seen by the public.
Well, before that, I could perhaps tell you that it was only the motif, and this painting was not presented to the public until 1914. Obviously, it was not finished before 1914. But before that, Sohlberg had made another version in 1901, which had traveled extensively, actually. But he never wanted to show it in Norway. So he showed it in Rome, in Denmark, in Vienna, and it traveled to 5 different venues in America, in the USA. And everywhere where it came, it caused a lot of attention because people were amazed about it. The color and the mood, and especially in USA, they saw it in New York, in Boston, in Chicago, different places, in 1912 to 13. And the painting was reproduced on the front pages of the newspapers, together with Munch. So he was quite famous, actually, or at least the painting and the motif was quite famous. And there were advertisements of taking the steamboat to the land of the midnight sun. So this is not actually midnight sun, but it's winter night, moonlight and starry night. So the Americans thought this was really Norwegian. But what's interesting is that when he displayed it in Denmark, one of the critics wrote quite extensively about this subject, and he said that Sohlberg doesn't belong to Norway, and this painting doesn't belong to Norway, or the 1901 painting doesn't belong to Norway. Sohlberg belongs to the world. And that was perhaps more in line with what Sohlberg would have wanted himself. But then, eventually, in 1914, July, Sohlberg managed to finish this big painting. And then he introduced the motif to the Norwegian audience. And that was at the Jubilee exhibition, celebrating the 100 years anniversary of the Norwegian constitution. And it was an exhibition, huge exhibition here in Oslo at Frogner. Here it immediately caused a lot of attention and people were amazed again. But what's interesting also is that in the newspapers, as we see here, a front page of 2 clippings from Aftenposten, one of the Oslo newspapers, we see another painting by Sohlberg on the left, and a painting by a very young artist called Per Krog on the right. It's a painting that's doesn't exist any longer, but it's a lost painting. But here Sohlberg was compared with the young generation. So, and it was both negative because he wasn't in line with the modern tendencies, but it was also kind of relief that you didn't have to look at things like this, like the Per Krog painting.
So it was a very sort of positive reaction
Yes.
from the majority of the,
Yes.
So the Norwegians already in a way, adopted it as,
Yeah, they did, because they recognized it in a way. And what's interesting is that the director of the National Gallery, Jens Thies, immediately tried to acquire it for the collection. And when Sohlberg had been acquired for the first time, he was not yet 25. You can see the painting here. It's not, no? Okay.
Oh yeah,
sorry.
no, it was the painting where I showed there's a cross section.
Yes.
We're showing the different.
The red painting
the red,
called Evening Glow.
Evening Glow.
But anyway, when this was acquired, he was regarded as very modern. But when Thies wanted to buy this one, the board protested because it was too old-fashioned. They didn't want to buy it. And then Thies managed to get the shipping magnate Jørgen Brede Stang to buy it. And immediately after the board had been changed, the members of the board, Thies managed to get Stang to donate it to the museum. So.
And that was in 1918. 18.
Yes.
But before then, it had it not been to an exhibition in.
Before
in
that,
in the States. Yeah,
before that, it had been in an exhibition in San Francisco, the International Exhibition in 1915. So, do we have an image of the label?
Yes, because it's quite nice actually. There's although the painting was lined and the stretcher was sorry, the stretcher was replaced. There is still a label that they left, which is just up here. I can see it.
Yeah.
You should be able to see it on the screen. Whereas, as you say, where he received honorary medal in gold, a gold medal, was it? Am I correct? Yeah.
So he was quite famous in his time, but he never had a solo exhibition because he never had enough paintings, because he spent so much time finishing every work because of this detailed method. But then the first solo exhibitions, international exhibitions, were in London and Germany.
In 2019,
yes. And that was an exhibition that was first presented here in Oslo. And it was really interesting how they perceived it, but because in London, the London newspapers, they were writing about the cozy works of Sohlberg, and that we could need it here in England now because of Brexit. And in Germany, all the critics pointed to the German traditions of German philosophy and German romantic painting. But it's interesting to see how differently the same work can be perceived. But anyway, it's up to all and each and every one of us how we perceive it, because we can read many different things into it and have different experiences. And I hope you will all come and have that experience in 2022 when we open the new museum. And you can see an illustration of the room here. This is approximately what it will look like. He will be in a room next to the Munch room with sculptors and other painters.
Yeah, and one thing we didn't actually, before we take questions, and something that that means people have to go and see it, because we weren't able to show you the frame, which is also another sort of chapter in Sohlberg's art in a way, because it has quite an amazing frame. So you'll just have to come and see it in 2022.
It's
but
black.
I think, I think we have time for questions if
That would be great.
Yeah.
Please.
Perfect. First question is from the live stream. I know that the top of one of the peaks there is a formation of snow that looks like a cross. You talked about that. But did he have something in mind when highlighting this in this way in the final painting? It's not that visible in the other versions, is it? Or in the sketches?
It's on the sketches from 1911. So it's we can't know what he was thinking, obviously. And he denied that it was a cross. He said, this is there naturally. He didn't want to we don't know if he was Christian at all, because in the early period of his life, he was an atheist. But then after his mother died, he was starting to think more about salvation, Christianity, but we don't know if he really was Christian at any time. But obviously, this is a symbol that's very integrated in Western culture. And he knew that everybody would recognize it and have some kind of association with it, and think about death, and think about salvation, think about the afterlife. So it fits really well. But it is a scar in Rondane, in one of the mountain peaks. So it's naturally there. And maybe it's a bit more like an X.
Yeah,
but
I mean, I've seen it. I haven't climbed all the way up there, but I've seen it, and when you know it's there, you can see it. But it's. I mean, here in the painting, it's very distinctively a cross, compared to what you see in nature. I agree. Yeah.
Perfect. And then there's a question about the face that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Can this be a troll? Can this be Dovregubben from Peer Gynt?
Well, yes, it can be, and we don't know, and it's an ambivalent feature, because it's not a face. It reminds us of a face, and it's also a mountain. But it's like if the mountains are not real mountains, it's not true geology, is it?
No.
It's more like it's alive, and it's like it's growing in a way. And of course it could be Dovregubben, or it could be any other troll, or it could be just a way to say that to make the connection between human beings and nature, that there is a connection. And this anthropomorphic understanding of nature as something reminding of human features. So you have other artists, as mentioned, that some artists would even make the mountains look like a reclining woman figure, and the trees like branches stretching out like hands. So it's can be a troll, yes.
Yeah, and that kind of ties in with the topic of the next episode we're going to have with Kittelsen, because he's known for having these trees that look like trolls. There's someone who's wondering if you could talk about the star in the painting.
Oh yeah, this one here. Yeah. There's also the constellation in the top left. I don't know if you can see that, but but I think Mai Britt.
Well, yes. Again, this is a very tricky subject, because the starry sky is not a true representation of a constellation, of a celestial constellation. It's a composition. So he worked a lot on the composition of the sky, and the stars. And in some of the early drawings, he just scattered them around. But here he has made this bright star, very shiny, and it's probably Venus. It has been assumed it's the polar star,
North Star.
Professor Øyvind Bjerke, in this catalogue, he has an article about this motif, and he has been in contact with an astronomer who has helped him. And but also the constellation up in the left corner, it's a kind of aborted little bare constellation. It's because it should be 7 stars, not 6. So it's not a true representation of the sky. But the point is that, to Sohlberg, I think, is that this is just a way to say that this painting has cosmic dimensions. It's about being a human being under the stars. We are in this world, and we are embraced by huge nature. And so I think it's like a poem of, as T said, it's shining architecture and frozen poem.
Thank you. Then we have someone who's saying, thank you for a very interesting presentation. She has a question. I've always thought that the trees in the foreground doesn't really fit the motif, and they look almost like Japanese prints. Is there an influence there, you think?
Definitely. And also perhaps the composition as a whole. But there are probably several sources of inspiration, and also other Norwegian artists like the earlier romantic painters like August Cappelen and Dahl, Johan Christian Dahl, and even Sohlberg's contemporary, a little bit older, Torolf Holmboe. And some art historians have also pointed to the German painter Friedrich, but Sohlberg probably didn't have the access to see so many works of Friedrich. But
Although he travelled.
he traveled, but not so many works were on display in the museum, so
Right,
that's interesting. But in a way, you could say that also let's have a look at the trunk in front here, because it could also look like a snake, or it's a bit eerie if you start to think about it. It's rotting trees, but it's also ambivalent and not so clear all the time what it is. But at the same time, if you have been out there and looking at the mountain moors and it also looks like this. So.
But also, just to mention that there are some very nice pencil sketches of the trees that that he's obviously made before, and then it's not very stylized in a way, but very interesting. And something that I didn't mention, this is quite interesting because the trees and the foreground. The thing is, the painting has changed quite a lot, especially after given its condition. Forgot to mention that. Sorry, I can mention it now. But it's also the lining, the wax lining. Unfortunately, that has flattened a bit the painting, so we're losing a bit of some differences in texture. So you do have this sort of glazing technique going on here, but here I think this would have been much more prominent. It would have been more a little impasto, so you would have got a different effect, and also with the star actually, something that you can't perhaps see so much on camera, but we're kind of hoping you can see that. But still, the painting is incredible, despite it's had a sort of difficult conservation history, and has had that lining. It still has that amazing glow to it. So I find that very impressive, actually. Sorry, diverted a bit here.
No, absolutely not.
Oh, thank you. The white-blue contrast is very strong. The white seems to be lit. What kind of paints do you use for the white? Do you know that?
Yeah, so it's lead white, which was used at the time. So at least that's the readings. If you remember, there's a picture which just shows you this handheld XRF, which allows me to non-destructively, non-invasively get an idea of the different elements, and they're like we saw with the Scream, and then I can sort of interpret that and what kind of pigments. So it's mainly lead white, but there's probably a lot of lead white. There's probably lead white ground, and also and cobalt blue, and also cobalt violet, and yeah, there's a. So is this, I hope that answers the question. But this would have been painted much thicker. Lead white actually dries, is quicker, and is easier maybe to. He's used it in a different way, more sort of in a textured way. And this is, if you, this might be difficult, we don't have an image of it, but that's another reason you have to come back in 2022. But there's two really lovely pictures of Røros, for the mining town up north, where he stayed for a while, and which is on the World Heritage List.
Yes.
Lovely little town worth visiting as well. Combine that into your trip. There's a lot of publicity for Norway here.
Oh, yeah.
What's happening? What's happening? But anyway, and there you see there's a lovely contrast because these paintings haven't been lined, so we still get that nice contrast with these bright, vibrant colours with this glazing technique, and then this real sort of thick, sort of impasto
Yes,
brush for representing the snow or depicting the snow.
It's almost like it's a relief. Because it's not thick brush strokes. It's more like a thick layer of paint.
Yeah. So it's very much like the snow on the on the roof.
It's really
and you can see the underdrawing with the naked eye sometimes in those paintings.
Yeah, very nice. Then we have a couple of questions from Instagram. Why has the artist painted and drawn so many sketches before doing this big painting? Is there a reason for the amount of sketches and the time it took?
Well, yes. He didn't want to just represent a portrait of a place and not make a kind of neutral view. He wanted to understand what he was looking at. He wanted to imprint on his mind, and then using all the sketches as an aid. So he needed all of these sketches in order to be able to make this big painting.
Yeah, I mean, he's 14 years he's struggling with this work, back and forth, and a lot of, we're obviously not able to speak about everything that happens in between, but it's kind of interesting. So he had that goal to create this painting, and I think. Well, at least I found it interesting when I actually went there myself. There actually exists, the family had also kindly loaned a map that they found in his belongings where he's marked some sort of crosses where it appears, we're not too sure, but it's probably where he's being sort of tracing the different areas. And if you go there yourself, I actually did it myself and followed these paths, you do get you actually also get this feeling that Mai Britt was talking about, where you come out from, suddenly the mountains suddenly do pop up from the trees, but it's not this view. This view is very contrived. So it's a really interesting evolution of an idea, which, like you mentioned, is written up by the Professor Sohlbergs. So it's all in here.
You can buy it in our shop, even online.
The last question, what was Sohlberg's relationship with Rondane? Why is it this area and in this region?
Well, that's a good question, and we can't know for sure. But of course, it was a love affair in a way. With his first visit in Easter 1899, he was amazed, and he just needed to make a painting of it. And he spent more than 2 years in this landscape. And he was on good foot with the local people, but he was also very much alone, except for the periods when he had his family there. So, but he was, all his career, he was dependent on finding specific places where he could stay to find his motifs, and Rondane was one of those.
Yeah, and do go there. Probably a lot of the viewers have been there, but it's a wild and desolate place, and it's and I think the attraction. You have to correct me if I'm wrong here, but it has about 10 summits that are over 2,000 meters. So it is a special place. I could see the attraction, but like you say, he was searching also for other things. Yeah. But it's difficult to know. He hasn't actually written it in his diaries or anything particularly.
It's a fascinating place. Yeah. It's desolate and fascinating. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. This is very interesting, and it's nice to get some more insight into the history behind it and the state it's in now, and when we're going to see it again. So thank you all at home for watching. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And the next episode will be on the 16th of February. It's a Tuesday, and the topic will be Theodor Kittelsen's Black Death series. And as always, you can watch our live streams again online on Facebook and YouTube, where they're published. And you can also there watch Scream from December, which was the first episode in this series, called Close Encounters. Thank you all for watching, and have a good night.